She threw forged bank statements onto my human resources director's desk, screaming that I drained my dying father's hospice fund to finance a luxury lifestyle. Security escorted me out of the building in front of 50 colleagues. I had no defense, no proof, and by sunset, I was facing a $150,000 civil suit. Then, sitting in my trashed apartment, I found the grease-stained leather calendar my father kept in his garage. I opened it. Every single transaction for the last 4 years was documented in his meticulous handwriting right next to the chilling threats she used to extort him. I brought that calendar to the Sunday family dinner, slid it across the mahogany table without a word, and watched her expensive makeup lose all its color. The hollow thud of a leather handbag hitting the glass desk made me jump. My Aunt Beatrice Sterling stood in the center of the Human Resources office. She wore a tailored cream suit and a practiced expression of maternal devastation. Without a word to me, she dropped a thick stack of printed bank statements directly in front of my director, Mr. Davis. "Look at them," Beatrice demanded. Her voice pierced through the thin glass walls of the office, carrying straight into the open cubicle floor where my coworkers were sitting. "Look at the transaction dates, Richard. My brother Thomas died of pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. While he was lying in a hospice bed fighting for breath, his youngest daughter was draining his end-of-life care fund. $75,000 transferred directly into her personal checking account." I froze. The compliance reports in my hands slipped and scattered across the carpet. I had spent the last 3 years auditing financial records for this medical network, hunting down internal fraud. Now my own aunt was standing in my office framing me for the exact crime I investigated for a living. "Aunt B, what are you talking about?" I asked, my voice tight. I stepped toward the desk, reaching for the papers. She snatched them back. "Do not play the victim with me, Claire," she hissed. "You forged his signature on those checks. You bought designer clothes and booked vacations while your sister and I paid for his palliative care out of our own pockets." Mr. Davis adjusted his glasses, his face unreadable. Beatrice sat on the hospital network's donor advisory board. Her annual charity galas funded his department's bonus structure. He did not look at me. He looked at the floor. "Claire, I need you to hand over your security badge," Davis said. His tone was clinical. "Corporate policy mandates an immediate suspension pending a full investigation into these allegations. We cannot have an auditor accused of felony embezzlement accessing sensitive financial data." I stared at him. "You are suspending me based on unverified papers she just walked in here with." Beatrice leaned over the desk. "I have already filed a police report. The detectives will be contacting you shortly. You are a disgrace to your father's memory." Davis pressed a button on his desk phone. 2 uniformed security guards appeared at the glass door seconds later. They did not ask me to pack my personal belongings. They simply stood on either side of me waiting. I walked out of that office empty-handed. 50 pairs of eyes watched me from the cubicle farm. People I had eaten lunch with, people I had trained, all staring with quiet judgment. The silence was deafening. I kept my spine straight, refusing to give Beatrice the satisfaction of seeing me break. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the biting Chicago wind. My career was suspended. My reputation was ruined. I stood on the pavement trying to process how my life had unraveled in less than 10 minutes. Then my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. It was not a text from a concerned friend. It was a notification that the nightmare was just beginning. "My name is Claire Bennett. I am 30 years old, and until last Tuesday, I worked as a compliance auditor for a major healthcare network in Chicago." Before I tell you how a single desk calendar dismantled a high society fraud scheme, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe the truth always outlives a lie. I sat behind the steering wheel of my sedan. The engine remained off. The winter cold of the Chicago parking garage seeped through the windshield, yet the chill radiating through my chest had nothing to do with the weather. My hands gripped the leather wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. I stared at the dashboard, struggling to process the public execution of my career that had just occurred upstairs. My phone rested in the center console. It began to vibrate. It was not a single alert. It was a continuous, unrelenting pulse that rattled the plastic cup holder. I picked it up. The screen illuminated the dim interior of the car. 40 unread messages. They were all from the extended family group chat, a chat I had been removed from mere minutes prior. I could only see the direct messages flooding in from cousins, aunts, and uncles I had not spoken to since my father died. The notification banners stacked on top of each other in rapid succession. Thief. Disgrace. You belong in a cell. How could you do this to your own blood? Beatrice had not just walked into my human resources department to get me fired. She had orchestrated a synchronized digital execution. She had launched a smear campaign across every social media platform and family channel before I even had the chance to pack my desk. A voicemail icon popped onto the screen. It was from my older sister, Olivia. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker. The audio filled the silent car. "You are scum, Claire." Olivia spoke with a slow, deliberate venom. "I always knew you were jealous of the rest of us, but this is a new low. You stole Dad's chemotherapy money to fund your pathetic life. Beatrice showed us the bank statements. We know everything. Do not ever come near this house again. If I see you at the memorial service next week, I will personally have you dragged out in handcuffs." The message ended with a sharp beep. I stared out at the concrete pillars of the parking garage. Olivia was 32 years old. She lived in a gated community in the suburbs, driving a luxury sport utility vehicle funded entirely by our father's early investments. She had never spent a single night sleeping in that uncomfortable plastic chair next to his hospice bed. While she was attending wine tastings and country club luncheons, I had spent 6 months in that intensive care unit. I had tracked his oxygen levels, managed his pain medication schedules, and held his hand while he forgot his own name. Now Olivia was playing the devastated righteous daughter standing on a moral high ground she had never earned. My fingers felt numb. I dialed the only person who could stop this nightmare. I called Cynthia, my mother. She answered on the 4th ring. Her breathing was ragged, catching in her throat. "Mom," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Aunt B just showed up at my job. She is spreading lies about Dad's hospice fund. You have to tell them it is not true. You were there when we set up the accounts. You know I managed every penny strictly for his care." A loud theatrical sob echoed through the speaker. I could not believe it when B told me my mother wailed. Her voice lacked its usual softness. It sounded rigid, rehearsed. "How could you do this to him, Claire? He was dying." "Mom, listen to me. I did not take a single dime. Those statements are fabricated." "He trusted you," she cried louder, ignoring my words entirely. "B warned me you were getting greedy. She warned me you resented him for being sick. You stole the money that was supposed to keep him comfortable. You put him in the grave faster. You killed him, Claire." The words hit me like a physical strike to the ribs. You killed him. My mother, 58 years old, a woman who had spent her entire marriage avoiding conflict and hiding behind her husband, was now weaponizing Beatrice's exact script. I realized in that sickening moment that my aunt had gotten to her first. Beatrice had isolated the weakest link in the family, manipulated her grief, and turned her into a compliant mouthpiece. "Mom, please, use your head. Look at the facts. Put B on the phone right now. I have nothing else to say to a thief," Cynthia choked out. She ended the call. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a flat, endless drone that signaled the end of my family ties. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. My breathing grew shallow. The air in the car felt thick, unbreathable. I needed proof. I needed to see the trust fund logs myself. If Beatrice had printed forged statements to show my director, I could counter them with the actual digital ledger. I snatched the phone back and opened my mobile banking application. I typed in my secure credentials. The loading icon spun for a fraction of a second. A stark red banner appeared across the screen. "Account access restricted. Please contact your branch administrator for further assistance." My heart slammed against my ribs. I typed the password again, thinking my hands had slipped. The same red banner glared back at me. I tried to access my personal savings account. The account I had built from years of auditing salaries, completely separate from my father's estate. Restricted. I checked my primary checking account. Restricted. Beatrice had not just filed a police report to ruin my reputation. She had somehow triggered a fraud freeze on my entire financial identity. She had locked me out of my own life. I was sitting in a freezing parking lot with no job, no family, and zero access to my own money. I could not hire a defense attorney. I could not buy gas. I could not even pay for a hotel room to hide in. The trap was flawless. She had severed every lifeline I had before I even knew I was under attack. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, fighting the urge to scream. I needed a lawyer. I needed to get back to my apartment, grab my tax documents, my physical bank files, anything that could prove my innocence before the bank seized my assets permanently. I reached for the ignition key. The phone lit up again. A text message notification broke through the dark screen. It was not from a furious cousin or an enraged aunt. It was from Jamal Washington, Olivia's husband. Jamal was a 34-year-old commercial real estate appraisal director. He was the only person in the Sterling family orbit who operated on logic rather than emotion. While Olivia thrived on drama and Beatrice traded in manipulation, Jamal dealt strictly in market value risk assessment and verifiable facts. He rarely engaged in family gossip. He stayed quiet at holiday dinners, watching the dynamics play out from the sidelines. I opened the message. It was brief. 2 sentences that changed the entire trajectory of my afternoon. Do not go home. Police are on their way to your apartment right now. Stay away. I stared at the glowing text. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. Beatrice had mobilized the authorities faster than I anticipated. If I went back to my apartment to gather my files, I would be walking right into an ambush. I would be arrested, locked in a county holding cell, stripped of my phone and any chance to defend myself. Beatrice would cement her lies into the official police narrative while I sat behind bars, unable to post bail from a frozen bank account. I shifted the car into drive. I did not know where I was going, but Jamal was right. I had to disappear. The net was closing, and I was out of time. I drove through the gridlocked Chicago streets with my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Jamal had warned me to stay away, but avoiding my apartment was not an option. My digital life had been erased in an instant. My bank accounts were frozen. My corporate access was revoked. The only shield I had left against Beatrice and her fabricated narrative was sitting inside a fireproof lockbox under my desk. I needed my tax returns, my physical banking ledgers, and the printed medical receipts I had saved from my father's hospice care. I needed paper. Paper could not be locked behind a red restriction banner. I parked 3 blocks away, leaving my car in a generic retail structure, and walked the rest of the way through the biting winter wind. My chest ached with every breath. I bypassed the main lobby of my building, taking the service stairs up to the 4th floor. I moved in silence, my mind racing through survival strategies, calculating how quickly I could pack a duffel bag and disappear into a cheap motel until I found a defense lawyer willing to work pro bono. I reached my door. I slid the key into the deadbolt and turned it. The lock clicked. Before I could even push the door open, a heavy fist hammered against the wood right beside my head. The sound fired through the quiet hallway like a gunshot. Chicago Police, Financial Crimes Unit. Open the door, Miss Bennett. My lungs seized. I stepped back, my hand dropping from the handle. They did not wait for an invitation. The door swung open, pushed inward by a tall, broad-shouldered detective wearing a dark overcoat and a cynical scowl. Close behind him was a second detective, a woman with sharp, observant eyes and a clipboard tucked under her arm. They stepped into my living room, instantly shrinking the space, dominating the environment with their sheer presence. Detective Harrison, the tall one, announced, flashing a badge. "This is Detective Russo. We have a warrant to search these premises." He thrust a folded white document toward my chest. I did not take it. I stared at the bold black lettering at the top of the page. The seal of the county court glared back at me. They had moved with terrifying speed. Beatrice had not just filed a standard complaint. She had pulled strings, leveraged her donor status, and bypassed weeks of standard bureaucratic delays to send investigators straight to my door. "You cannot be here," I said, my voice sounding hollow in my own ears. "I have not been charged with anything. I have not even spoken to a lawyer." "We do not need you to be charged to execute a search warrant," Russo said. Her tone was clinical, detached. "Step away from the doorway and have a seat on the kitchen stool. Do not touch your pockets. Do not attempt to use your phone." I moved to the kitchen island on trembling legs. Harrison bypassed me entirely, walking straight toward my home office alcove. I watched in paralyzed silence as he yanked open the drawers of my desk, pulling out files, folders, and notebooks. He tossed them onto the rug, sifting through my life with ruthless efficiency. Russo stepped in front of me, blocking my view of the search. She unclipped a pen from her breast pocket. "Thomas Bennett passed away 8 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. Is that correct?" "Yes," I whispered. For the final 6 months of his life, he was confined to an intensive care unit and later a hospice facility. Russo continued reading from her notes. He was administered heavy doses of morphine. He lost cognitive function by November. He could not manage his own estate, let alone authorize major wire transfers. You were his primary caretaker. I spent every night in that hospital. I replied, my voice gaining a fraction of its strength. I monitored his heart rate. I changed his bedding. I managed his daily care. But I did not manage his wealth. My Aunt Beatrice Sterling held the power of attorney over his business accounts. She held the physical checkbook. I never had access to his capital. Russo tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a plastic evidence bag. She laid it flat on the granite counter between us. Then explain this, Miss Bennett. I looked down. Inside the clear plastic was a high-resolution printed photograph of a personal check. It was drawn directly from my father's primary end-of-life care fund. The payee line read my name, Claire Bennett. The amount box was filled with neat, precise numbering, $75,000. But that was not what made the blood drain from my face. My eyes locked onto the bottom right corner of the paper. There, written in unmistakable blue ink, was my own looping signature. I stopped breathing. The kitchen walls seemed to tilt inward. I stared at the blue ink, my mind scrambling backward through time, tearing through months of sleepless nights and hospital alarms. And then the memory hit me. It struck with such force that I had to grip the edge of the granite counter to keep from collapsing. It was mid-December. The winter storms had knocked out the power in the hospital wing for 10 minutes. I was operating on 3 hours of sleep spread across 4 days. The ventilator beside my father's bed was humming its relentless rhythm. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his skin pale and fragile. Beatrice had walked into the room wearing a cashmere coat. She smelled of expensive perfume and cold espresso, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of bleach and illness. She carried a leather binder. She told me the palliative care nurses needed to be paid out of pocket for an emergency procedure. She said she had to run down to the pharmacy and did not have time to fill out the paperwork. She handed me a pen. She asked me to sign the bottom of 3 blank checks. She promised to fill in the vendor names and the exact medical amounts later. I signed them. I was exhausted, terrified of losing my father, and desperate to keep his care uninterrupted. I trusted my own blood. She planned this, I choked out. The realization tasted like ash in my throat. She set this up 6 months ago. She asked me to sign blank checks for his nurses. She kept them. She filled in my name. Russo did not blink. She did not offer sympathy. She simply tapped the plastic bag. This signature authorized the liquidation of a dying man's medical fund. The money was wired to a clearing account and then deposited into a ledger linked to your Social Security number. You can tell your story to a judge, but the paper trail is definitive. In the background, Harrison pulled my silver work laptop from my desk. He wrapped a thick black cord around it and slid it into a nylon evidence bag. "No," I shouted, stepping off the stool. "You cannot take that. That laptop has my compliance software. It has encrypted backups of my financial audits. That is my proof. If you take that, I have no way to trace the routing numbers she used." "Sit down," Harrison barked, pointing a rigid finger at me. "We are seizing all electronics capable of financial transactions. That includes hard drives, tablets, and external storage." He zipped the bag shut. The sound of the tearing nylon felt like the sealing of my own coffin. My tools, my records, my entire defense strategy had just been confiscated by the very people Beatrice was manipulating. Russo extended her hand toward me, palm up. "We also need your passport." I stared at her hand. "You are treating me like a fugitive." $75,000 is a major felony, Russo replied coldly. "You have no job. You have frozen accounts. You are a designated flight risk. Hand it over." I walked on numb legs to my bedroom, retrieved my passport from the bedside drawer, and handed it to the detective. I was effectively grounded, stripped of my mobility, my money, and my voice. They had dismantled my life in under 20 minutes. Harrison and Russo moved toward the front door, their arms full of sealed evidence bags containing my hard drives and financial ledgers. I stood in the center of the wrecked living room, surrounded by pulled drawers and scattered papers. Before exiting, Harrison stopped. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It lacked the seal of the police department. It looked expensive. He tossed it onto the kitchen counter. It landed next to my keys with a dull thud. "We are leaving with the evidence," Harrison said, his hand resting on the doorknob. "But you have a separate issue to deal with. That envelope was delivered to our precinct this morning by Sterling & Associates." I looked at the envelope. Sterling & Associates was Beatrice's private legal team. "It is a civil demand letter," Harrison continued, his tone devoid of any emotion. "Your aunt is offering you a window. Her lawyers are demanding the remittance of $150,000. That covers the principal amount you allegedly embezzled, plus legal fees and punitive damages for emotional distress to the family." I looked up at him in sheer disbelief. "She wants me to pay double the amount she framed me for. You have 7 days to wire the funds to her designated escrow account," Harrison stated, ignoring my shock. "If the money clears the account by next Friday, she has agreed to formally withdraw the criminal complaint. We drop the investigation. The matter gets settled privately." He opened the door, stepping out into the hallway. "If you miss the deadline, Miss Bennett, I come back here with an arrest warrant. And next time, I am bringing handcuffs." The door clicked shut, leaving me standing alone in the freezing silence of my apartment. The extortion was brilliant in its cruelty. Beatrice was not just trying to destroy my reputation. She was using the Financial Crimes Unit as her personal debt collectors. She had fabricated a crime, initiated a police raid, and backed me into a corner where my only escape was to pay her a ransom I did not have. The ticking clock had started, and I had exactly 7 days to save my own life. I stood completely still in the center of my dismantled living room. The silence left behind by the detectives was heavy, suffocating. My eyes remained fixed on the cream-colored envelope resting on the granite counter. $150,000, 7 days, a ransom note disguised as a civil demand letter delivered by the very police officers investigating me. I reached out and touched the thick paper. The smooth texture sent a violent shudder through my memory, dragging me forcefully backward in time. 8 months ago, the intensive care unit at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The air in that room smelled of iodine and impending loss. The steady mechanical hiss of the ventilator was the only sound keeping me grounded. I sat in a hard plastic chair beside my father's bed. I had been in that chair for 72 hours straight, surviving on vending machine crackers and lukewarm tap water. Thomas Bennett lay tangled in a web of intravenous lines, his breathing shallow, his skin taking on a translucent, fragile quality that terrified me. The heavy glass door slid open, breaking the sterile quiet. Aunt Beatrice swept into the room, bringing with her a cloud of heavy floral perfume that instantly overpowered the smell of antiseptic. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, carrying a pristine leather portfolio under her arm. She did not look at my father. Her eyes flicked straight to me, assessing my exhausted state with a practiced, calculating gaze. "Claire, you look terrible," Beatrice stated, her voice brisk, devoid of any genuine concern. "Go downstairs and get a decent cup of coffee. You are practically sleepwalking." I shook my head, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. "I am fine, Aunt B. I want to be here if he wakes up. The nurses said his lucid moments are getting shorter." Beatrice stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She placed her hand on my shoulder, not as a comfort, but as a firm directive. "I am here now. I will sit with my brother. Go take a walk. Clear your head. You are no good to him if you collapse on the floor." Her insistence felt less like care and more like a command, but the exhaustion was crushing me. My vision blurred at the edges. I nodded slowly, standing up on stiff legs. I promised to be quick, grabbed my purse, and walked out into the corridor. I only made it as far as the elevator bank before a wave of nausea hit me. I leaned against the cool tile wall, realizing I needed water more than coffee. I turned back, walking softly down the hall toward the ICU bay. As I approached my father's room, I stopped. The heavy glass door was partially ajar. Through the narrow gap, I saw Beatrice standing over the bed. She had opened her leather portfolio. She held a thick stack of legal documents. My father's eyes were barely open, clouded with morphine and pain. His right arm was bruised and trembling, resting weakly on the blanket. Beatrice grabbed his hand, not to hold it, but to manipulate it. She pressed his fingers around a pen, physically forcing his shaking hand toward the bottom line of the document. "Sign it, Thomas." Beatrice whispered, her tone low and urgent. Just make your mark. It secures the trust for the girls. Do it now before the doctors come back. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pushed the door open, stepping into the room. Aunt B, what are you doing? I demanded, my voice cutting through the hiss of the ventilator. What is that paper? Beatrice whipped her head around. She dropped his hand, instantly sliding the document back into her portfolio with lightning speed. She smoothed the front of her blazer, her expression hardening into a mask of righteous indignation. I am ensuring your father's final wishes are documented properly, she snapped, glaring at me. Something you clearly neglected to do while you were sitting here playing the devoted daughter. Before I could demand to see the paper, the door opened behind me. My mother, Cynthia, and my sister, Olivia, walked in. They were both holding expensive lattes, looking entirely too rested for a family keeping a death vigil. What is going on in here? Cynthia asked, her voice trembling nervously. Claire is causing a scene, Beatrice declared, instantly launching her defense before I could speak. I am trying to organize the palliative care directives, and she is throwing accusations around like a paranoid child. I pointed at the portfolio in Beatrice's hands. She was forcing his hand onto a document, Mom. He is barely conscious. He cannot legally consent to anything right now. She is making him sign something under heavy narcotics. Olivia rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh. Oh my God, Claire, stop creating drama. Aunt B is trying to help us manage the estate because you are too incompetent to handle the paperwork. She is paying out of pocket for the specialists, and you are standing here interrogating her. I looked at my mother, pleading for her to intervene. Mom, you know he is not lucid. Tell her to stop. Cynthia wrung her hands, refusing to meet my eyes. She looked at Beatrice, then at the floor. B knows what she is doing, Claire. She has the family lawyers. Do not be so disrespectful. She is only trying to protect our assets. I stood there utterly outnumbered, watching the three women form a unified wall of denial. I realized then that they had already decided the narrative. Beatrice was the savior, and I was the hysterical, ungrateful burden. They had handed the keys to my father's legacy over to a predator, and they were punishing me for noticing the theft. The memory dissolved rapidly, snapping me back to the freezing reality of my ransacked apartment. I stood over the granite counter, the demand letter still resting next to my keys. The document Beatrice had forced my dying father to sign 8 months ago was undoubtedly the power of attorney that granted her access to the accounts. She had orchestrated the entire framework of her extortion while he was taking his final breaths. My phone vibrated sharply in my pocket, shattering the silence. The sudden noise made me jump. I pulled it out. The caller ID displayed my mother's name, Cynthia. I stared at the screen. She had hung up on me less than an hour ago, repeating Beatrice's lies and calling me a murderer. Why was she calling back now? Perhaps she had realized the absurdity of the accusations. Perhaps she had remembered the daughter who had actually stayed by her husband's side. I swiped the screen to answer, pressing the phone to my ear. Mom. I breathed desperation creeping into my voice. Did you talk to the police? Did you tell them B forced those signatures? Cynthia did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was holding up after the raid. Her voice was brittle, trembling with a forced, practiced severity. I am calling to give you formal notice, Claire. The coldness in her tone struck me like a physical blow. Notice for what Beatrice has arranged an estate liquidation sale. Cynthia stated her words, rushing out as if she were reading from a script someone else had written for her. It starts tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock at the old house. I frowned, confusion battling with the rising panic in my chest. An estate sale. Mom, Dad has only been gone 8 months. We agreed to keep the house intact until the end of the year. What is going on? Cynthia let out a sharp, erratic breath. The plans have changed. Beatrice spoke with the lawyers. Since you stole $75,000 from the family, we have to recoup the losses immediately. B is selling everything. The furniture, his tools, his personal collections. Everything is being auctioned off tomorrow to cover the deficit you created. My knees gave out. I sank onto the edge of the couch, gripping the phone tight enough to crack the casing. You are selling Dad's things. His tools, the chair he built Mom. You cannot let her do this. Those are his memories. That is our family history. It is not family history anymore, Claire. Cynthia snapped, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. It is stolen property. You forfeited your right to those memories when you forged those checks. Beatrice is right. We have to liquidate the assets to save the estate.
Olivia and Jamal will be there to manage the buyers. You are strictly forbidden from stepping foot on the property." "Mom, please," I begged, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. "I am innocent." B set me up.
"If you let her sell his things, they are gone forever. You know how much those tools meant to him. Do not let her erase him to punish me for a crime I did not commit. If you show your face tomorrow, Beatrice will have the police arrest you for trespassing." Cynthia said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You brought this on yourself. Stay away from the house." The line went dead. I lowered the phone, staring at the darkened screen. The sheer cruelty of the tactic was breathtaking. Beatrice was not just content with destroying my career, freezing my assets, and threatening me with prison. She was systematically annihilating every physical connection I had left to my father. She was selling his life to the highest bidder under the guise of recovering the funds she herself had stolen. She knew the estate sale would break my spirit completely. She wanted me isolated, penniless, and entirely stripped of my past, ensuring I would have no fight left when the 7-day deadline for her extortion demand expired. I had less than 12 hours before my father's entire legacy was auctioned off on the front lawn. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by the wreckage the detectives had left behind, waiting for the sun to rise. At 7 in the morning, I drove out to the suburbs. I parked 2 blocks away from my childhood home, the engine of my car ticking in the freezing morning air. I knew I had been forbidden to attend. I knew Beatrice had threatened me with arrest, but I could not sit by and let her auction off my father's life without a fight. I walked down the familiar tree-lined street. The cold wind bit at my face, but I barely felt it. As I rounded the corner, the sight of my father's house stopped me in my tracks. The front lawn was already swarming with people, strangers, antique dealers, and neighborhood scavengers picking through the remnants of a life that was not theirs. Tables were set up across the grass, piled high with dishware books and framed photographs stripped of their context. My father's heavy oak armchair, the one he had sat in every evening to read the paper, was sitting near the curb with a neon pink price tag slapped onto the leather armrest. His vintage vinyl records were tossed carelessly into plastic bins. Standing on the front porch, holding a small battery-powered megaphone, was Beatrice. She wore a heavy camel hair coat and sunglasses, orchestrating the liquidation with the ruthless efficiency of a commanding officer. "Move the power tools to the front table," Beatrice barked into the megaphone, directing 2 burly men wearing estate sale company jackets. "Those will fetch a high price. Make sure the buyers know the riding mower is cash only." I scanned the crowd looking for my mother. I found her standing near the side of the house, huddled in a heavy winter coat, clutching a thermos of coffee. She was watching strangers carry away her husband's belongings, her face pale and drawn. She looked utterly defeated, yet she did absolutely nothing to stop it. I pushed through the crowd, ignoring the sharp elbows and the annoyed mutters of the bargain hunters. I reached the table where they were unloading my father's garage. A man in a flannel shirt was haggling over the price of the handcrafted toolbox my father had built from scrap mahogany. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking through the cold air. "You cannot sell that. That belongs to my family." The man stepped back, startled. Beatrice's head snapped toward me. She lowered the megaphone, her lips curling into a tight, furious line. "I told you she would show up," a voice sneered from behind me. Olivia marched across the lawn. She was flanked by the 2 estate sale security guards, broad-shouldered men in dark jackets. Olivia wore knee-high leather boots and a smirk that made my blood boil. "What are you doing here, Claire?" Olivia demanded, crossing her arms over her chest. "The police told you to stay away. You have a lot of nerve showing your face after what you did to this family." I ignored her, moving toward the table to grab the mahogany toolbox. "This is illegal, Olivia. You cannot liquidate the estate before the probate period ends. Dad has only been gone 8 months. Olivia snapped her fingers. The 2 security guards lunged forward. They grabbed my arms, hauling me backward with physical, aggressive force. I stumbled my boots, slipping on the frosted grass, and fell hard onto the frozen ground. The impact sent a sharp pain shooting up my spine. "Get her off the property," Beatrice ordered from the porch, not even bothering to use the megaphone. "She is a trespasser." I scrambled to my feet, my hands muddy and freezing. "Do not let her do this, Olivia," I pleaded, looking at my sister. "She is selling his life to cover up her own theft. She is destroying his memory." Olivia let out a harsh, mocking laugh. His memory. You are the one who drained his medical fund to buy designer bags, you pathetic thief. You are nothing but a washed-up, unemployed parasite. Aunt B is saving this family from the debt you created. Now get off the lawn before I call the cops and have you hauled away in cuffs." The bargain hunters had stopped haggling. Dozens of strangers stood on my father's lawn, watching me with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. I was the spectacle. I was the disgraced daughter being publicly humiliated by her own blood. My mother turned her back, walking toward the side gate to avoid looking at me. The security guard stepped forward again, cracking their knuckles, preparing to physically throw me into the street. I backed away, my chest heaving, the bitter sting of total defeat washing over me. I had lost. I had no money, no lawyers, and no power to stop the systematic erasure of my father's existence. I turned toward the driveway, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. As I walked past the edge of the property line, near the heavy green trash bins, waiting for municipal pickup, my eyes caught sight of something sitting on the concrete. It was a cardboard box, stained with dark grease and motor oil. The flaps were torn and the sides were bulging. Someone had tossed it unceremoniously against the trash cans, deeming it too worthless to even place on a sale table. Peeking out from the top of the box was a familiar piece of blue fabric. It was my father's old mechanic work shirt, the one he wore when he spent his weekends fixing up the sedan in the garage. Beatrice had thrown his personal garage items out with the garbage. I stopped. I stared at the greasy box. Olivia and the guards were still watching me from the lawn, waiting for me to leave. I did not care how I looked. I did not care what the strangers thought. I dropped to my knees on the cold concrete and pulled the heavy box into my arms. It smelled of old oil sawdust and the distinct, comforting scent of my father's garage. "Oh, look!" Olivia called out loudly, her voice dripping with cruel amusement. "The thief is digging through the trash. Take the garbage, Claire. It is exactly what you deserve. A fitting inheritance for a failure." Laughter rippled through the crowd. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the stinging humiliation. I hugged the heavy, filthy box to my chest, stood up, and walked down the street toward my car. I did not look back. I placed the box carefully in the passenger seat of my sedan, shivering violently as the adrenaline began to crash. I sat behind the wheel, staring blankly at the frosted windshield. I had salvaged a box of oily rags and broken tools while Beatrice auctioned off my father's legacy for cash. I felt utterly broken. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The sudden vibration startled me. I pulled it out, assuming it was another threat from Jamal or a gloating text from Olivia. It was an email notification. The sender was the legal department of the healthcare network I worked for. I opened the message with trembling fingers. The subject line read, "Formal Notice of Termination Hearing." The text was brief and clinical. "Dear Ms. Bennett, pursuant to the ongoing investigation regarding allegations of financial misconduct, your presence is required at a formal termination hearing. The disciplinary board will convene in 48 hours. Failure to attend will result in immediate termination of employment and the forwarding of all internal findings to local law enforcement. You are advised to secure legal counsel." I dropped the phone into my lap. 48 hours. The walls were closing in with terrifying speed. I had 2 days before I was officially fired, stripped of my credentials, and handed over to the police on a silver platter. I had 7 days before Beatrice's extortion deadline expired, triggering an arrest warrant. My family had disowned me. My bank accounts were frozen. My evidence had been confiscated by detectives. I looked at the greasy cardboard box sitting on the passenger seat. It was the only thing I had left in the world. I started the engine, pulling away from the curb, driving back toward the city, with absolutely no idea how I was going to survive the next 2 days. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building and carried the heavy, grease-stained box up the 4 flights of service stairs. I did not want to risk running into anyone in the elevator. I unlocked my door, stepped over the mess the detectives had left scattered across my rug, and engaged the deadbolt. I slid the chain lock into place, shutting out the world. I set the cardboard box down on the kitchen island. The silence of the apartment felt heavier now, pressing down on me with the weight of the impending termination hearing and the looming criminal charges. I had 48 hours to find a miracle. I pulled my father's old blue work shirt out of the box and pressed it to my face. It smelled faintly of motor oil and sawdust, a sharp metallic scent that brought a fresh wave of tears to my eyes. I folded the shirt carefully and set it aside. I tipped the box over, dumping the remaining contents onto the granite counter. A rusted crescent wrench clattered against the stone. A handful of loose screws scattered across the surface. Several crumpled receipts for hardware supplies and lumber spilled out, stained yellow with age. It was exactly what Beatrice had thought. It was a pile of worthless garage junk. I let out a shaky breath, running my hands through my hair in total defeat. I pushed the pile of receipts away. As I did, my hand brushed against something solid buried at the bottom of the pile. It was a thick, rectangular object bound in dark brown leather, worn smooth at the corners from years of handling. I pulled it free from the debris. It was a pocket-sized desk calendar. The embossed gold lettering on the front cover read 2019 to 2023. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized the leather binding instantly. It was the calendar my father always kept in the inner breast pocket of his winter coat, or tucked into the breast pocket of his flannel shirts. Thomas Bennett was a man of the old world. He did not trust digital banking apps or smartphone reminders. He documented his entire life with a fountain pen and paper. I opened the cover. The pages were slightly yellowed, the edges softened by constant thumbing. The squares for each day were filled with his meticulous microscopic handwriting, the sharp, deliberate script of a master craftsman who measured twice and cut once. I flipped to January 2020, expecting to see notes about doctor appointments, oil changes, or reminders to pay the utility bills. Instead, the entries were almost entirely numeric. January 14th. Withdrew $4,000 cash. Main branch. January 22nd. Wired $6,000. Account ending in 4309. I frowned, tracing the numbers with my finger. My father was a frugal man. He rarely carried cash, and he certainly did not make wire transfers of that magnitude without a specific documented reason. I turned the pages faster, scanning the months. March 5th. Liquidated mutual fund. $12,000. Delivered in person. Delivered to whom? I flipped forward to the year his cancer diagnosis was confirmed, the year his health began to fail rapidly, and Beatrice stepped in to manage the estate. The entries became frantic, the handwriting slightly more jagged, betraying the tremor in his hands as his illness progressed. August 12th. $15,000 cash. But it was not just the amount that made my blood run cold. It was the small bracketed note written directly beneath the number, squeezed into the tiny square of the calendar page. August 12th. $15,000 cash. B took it. Threatened to cancel Cynthia's health insurance premium if I refused. I stopped breathing. The air in the kitchen vanished. I stared at the tiny faded ink, my brain struggling to process the magnitude of the words. I turned the page with shaking fingers. October 3rd. $22,000. Liquidated emergency bonds. Beneath it, another bracketed note. B demanded the bonds. Threatened to write Olivia out of the family trust inheritance if I did not sign the transfer. My stomach plummeted. I gripped the edge of the granite counter to keep from collapsing. The dates, the massive withdrawals, the chilling specific threats. This was not a calendar. It was a ledger. It was a meticulous, handwritten record of systematic extortion. My father was not transferring money to pay for his medical care. He was being blackmailed. Beatrice had been bleeding him dry for years, using his love for my mother and his fear for Olivia's future as leverage to drain his assets while he was too sick to fight back. I flipped to December, the month I had signed those blank checks in the intensive care unit. The month Beatrice told me the palliative care nurses needed immediate payment. December 18th, $75,000, forced Claire to sign. B said she would stop the ventilator payments if I warned her. Tears blurred my vision. A sob ripped through my throat, a harsh, jagged sound that echoed in the empty apartment. He knew. My father knew she was using me to launder the final sum. He had documented the theft, hiding the truth in plain sight, trusting that his meticulous nature would outlast his failing body. He had buried his confession in a box of greasy tools, knowing Beatrice would never bother to look closely at the things she considered garbage. The $75,000 Beatrice accused me of stealing was the exact amount she had extorted from him on his deathbed. She had not just framed me to cover her tracks. She had used my signature to execute the final devastating theft of his estate, ensuring I would take the fall if anyone ever audited the accounts. I had the proof. The unalterable handwritten proof of a dying man detailing a multi-year extortion scheme. I held the calendar to my chest, the leather cool against my skin. The narrative had just shattered. Beatrice was not the grieving sister protecting the family estate. She was a predator who had systematically terrorized her brother into financial ruin. Before the realization could fully settle, a violent, rhythmic pounding erupted against my front door. It was not the authoritative knock of a police detective. It was a frantic, aggressive hammering that shook the doorframe. "Open the door, Claire. I know you are in there." I froze. The voice belonged to Mr. Henderson, the property manager of my apartment complex. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man who usually only communicated via printed notices slipped under the door. He had never come up to my floor personally. I shoved the calendar into the inner pocket of my blazer and walked slowly toward the entryway. I did not unlock the deadbolt. I pressed my face close to the door. "What do you want, Mr. Henderson?" "Open the door and take this notice," he shouted, his voice muffled by the thick wood. I slipped the chain off and turned the deadbolt, opening the door a fraction of an inch. Mr. Henderson stood in the hallway, his face flushed red with anger. He shoved a bright yellow piece of paper through the gap in the door, forcing me to take it. I looked down at the paper. Notice of immediate eviction, violation of lease terms. "What is this?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. "I paid my rent on the 1st of the month. I am not behind on any payments. You are in violation of the morality and criminal conduct clause in your lease agreement," Henderson snapped, jabbing a finger at the yellow paper. "I received a very disturbing phone call this morning from a prominent board member at the hospital network. She informed me that the police raided this unit yesterday for felony embezzlement. She told me you are a flight risk and a criminal liability to my building. Beatrice. She had called my landlord. She was not just content with taking my job and my family. She was systematically dismantling my basic human right to shelter. She wanted me homeless before the weekend. "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises," Henderson stated, crossing his arms over his chest. "If you are not out by Friday morning, I will have the sheriff remove you and your belongings physically. I am not harboring a thief in my building." He turned on his heel and marched down the hallway toward the elevators. I closed the door slowly, the yellow eviction notice trembling in my hand. 48 hours. The termination hearing at my job was in 48 hours. My eviction was in 48 hours. The police would issue a warrant for my arrest in 5 days if I did not pay the extortion demand. Beatrice had tightened the noose with flawless, ruthless precision. I leaned against the door, closing my eyes. I was entirely alone. I had no money, no home, and no family to turn to. But as I pressed my hand against the breast pocket of my blazer, feeling the solid, rectangular shape of my father's leather calendar, a new sensation began to replace the crushing despair. It was not hope. Hope was too fragile for what I needed now. It was cold, absolute clarity. Beatrice had built her entire empire of lies on the assumption that I was weak. She assumed I would crumble under the pressure, pay the ransom, and accept my role as the disgraced outcast. She forgot one crucial detail. She forgot what I did for a living. I was a compliance auditor. I spent my life hunting down hidden numbers, tracing illicit funds, and exposing corporate fraud. Beatrice had just handed a master ledger of extortion to a forensic auditor with absolutely nothing left to lose. I opened my eyes, staring at the wrecked living room. I did not need to run anymore. I needed to build a trap. I stood in the center of my apartment, the eviction notice discarded on the floor. The panic that had gripped me for the past 24 hours vanished, replaced by a glacial, hyper-focused calm. Beatrice had triggered the wrong defense mechanism. She had forced me out of the role of the grieving daughter and activated the compliance auditor. I walked to the kitchen island, picked up the leather-bound calendar, and carried it into the spare room I used as a home office. The detectives had stripped my desk of all electronics, but they had left behind my basic office supplies. I grabbed a roll of masking tape, a thick black marker, and a spool of red twine. I pushed the heavy oak desk aside, clearing the largest expanse of bare wall in the room. I began carefully tearing the pages out of my father's calendar, arranging them chronologically across the drywall. I worked in absolute silence, my eyes scanning the microscopic, meticulous handwriting. Thomas Bennett had not just recorded the extortion. He had documented the exact mechanisms of Beatrice's leverage. He had chronicled his own psychological torture. I taped the pages up, creating a visual timeline of a man being bled dry by his own sister. I stepped back, surveying the matrix of yellowed paper. I uncapped the black marker and began writing out the key data points on sticky notes, slapping them next to the corresponding calendar dates. I needed to see the patterns. I needed to understand how the money moved. August 14th, $15,000 cash. I wrote the number in bold black ink, pressing the note next to the calendar page. I drew a line to a second note containing my father's bracketed text. B threatened to cancel Cynthia's supplemental health insurance premium if I refused the withdrawal. My mother had a pre-existing cardiac condition. Without that supplemental insurance, her daily medications would have bankrupted them within months. Beatrice had held my mother's physical health hostage to extract $15,000. I moved down the wall to the next major cluster of dates. November 2nd, $30,000. Liquidated retirement portfolio. The accompanying threat was even more insidious. B demanded the funds, threatened to legally challenge the family trust, and tie up Olivia's inheritance in probate court for a decade if I did not sign the transfer. Beatrice had weaponized Olivia's future against him. She knew my father prized Olivia's financial security above all else, and she used that devotion as a blunt instrument to break his resistance. My father had traded his own retirement savings to buy peace for his eldest daughter. And how did Olivia repay him? By standing on his front lawn mocking me while Beatrice auctioned off the tools he bought with whatever pennies he had left over. I grabbed the spool of red twine, stretching a line from the November withdrawal to the final devastating entry in December, the $75,000, the money that Beatrice was currently using to frame me for felony embezzlement. I stared at the December page, reading my father's final note again. Forced Claire to sign. B said she would stop the ventilator payments if I warned her. I traced the red twine back and forth across the wall. The numbers were staggering. 15,000, 30,000, 75,000. But it was not just the amounts that mattered. It was the destination. Where did the money go? Beatrice was wealthy, but she lived beyond her means, maintaining a facade of high society philanthropy that required constant influxes of cash. She could not simply deposit $120,000 of extorted funds into her personal checking account without triggering a suspicious activity report with the IRS. She needed a mechanism to wash the money. I closed my eyes, recalling the stack of forged bank statements Beatrice had thrown onto the Human Resources Director's desk. The payee lines on those statements had my forged signature, but the routing numbers underneath were the key. I had spent 3 years auditing hospital vendor accounts. I recognized the structure of corporate routing codes. The routing numbers on those forged statements did not belong to a standard personal checking account. They belonged to a commercial entity. My eyes snapped open. I grabbed my phone, ignoring the low battery warning. I opened the mobile browser and navigated to the Illinois Secretary of State's corporate registry database. The public search function was archaic, but it was accessible without a secure terminal. I typed in Beatrice's full legal name, searching for any registered corporate entities or nonprofit organizations linked to her Social Security number. The search icon spun for several agonizing seconds. The results populated the screen: 3 defunct limited liability companies and 1 active nonprofit organization, the White Rose Foundation, registered as a philanthropic charity dedicated to end-of-life care for terminal patients. The primary trustee and sole executive director was Beatrice Sterling. The pieces slammed together with blinding clarity. The shock of the revelation sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. Beatrice was not just extorting my father. She was running a sophisticated money laundering operation. The White Rose Foundation was a shell company. She forced my dying father to liquidate his assets, ordered me to sign blank checks under the guise of paying for his care, and then deposited those checks directly into the foundation's corporate accounts. Because the foundation was registered as a charity providing end-of-life care, the massive influx of medical funds appeared entirely legitimate to any casual observer. She was washing the extorted money through a tax-exempt charity, wiping the paper trail clean, and then siphoning the funds out the back door to finance her luxury lifestyle. And she had engineered the entire scheme so that my signature was on the incoming deposits. If the IRS or the hospital network ever audited the foundation, the paper trail would point directly to me, the disgraced, embezzling daughter who had supposedly stolen from her father's estate to make fraudulent charitable donations. The calendar was not just a record of blackmail. It was the master key to a federal tax fraud and money laundering syndicate. I looked at the wall at the red twine connecting my father's suffering to Beatrice's criminal empire. The $75,000 was not missing. It was sitting in a tax-exempt corporate account, waiting to be spent on her next country club gala. The phone vibrated violently in my hand, shattering the intense silence of my office. The sudden noise made me jump. I looked at the caller ID. It was Jamal. I hesitated. Jamal had warned me about the police raid saving me from a devastating ambush, but he was still married to Olivia. He was still entrenched in the family dynamics that had just destroyed my life. I did not know whose side he was truly on, but I needed information. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Claire, where are you?" Jamal asked, his voice low and urgent. He sounded like he was speaking from a confined space, perhaps his car. "I am safe," I replied, keeping my location undisclosed. "Why are you calling Jamal?" "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his tone dropping to a serious, authoritative register. "The family is hosting a formal dinner this Sunday evening at Beatrice's estate. It is supposed to be a memorial gathering to honor Thomas, but that is a front. It is an ambush." I gripped the phone tighter. "An ambush for what?" "Beatrice is bringing her legal team to the dinner," Jamal continued, the urgency in his voice rising. "She is framing it as an intervention. They are going to invite you, and when you show up, they are going to lock you in the dining room and force you to sign a confession." My stomach churned. A confession? Yes. A notarized document admitting to the embezzlement, along with a legally binding promissory note for the $150,000. Jamal paused, his breath hitching slightly. "Claire, if you sign that paper, you are dead. It gives her the civil judgment she needs to bankrupt you permanently, and it serves as a signed confession for the criminal detectives. She is using the family dinner to execute the extortion in front of witnesses. She wants your mother and Olivia to watch you admit to stealing the money." I stared at the wall of calendar pages, my eyes tracing the red twine connecting my father's final days to Beatrice's cruelty. The audacity of her plan was staggering. She wanted to break me publicly, ensuring I would never be able to claim innocence again. "Do not go," Claire Jamal warned, his voice grave. "They have security. They have lawyers. They are going to corner you and threaten you with immediate arrest if you refuse to sign. Stay away from the house. Go to a lawyer. Go to the press. Do anything but show up at that dinner." I was silent for a long moment. The fear that had paralyzed me earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Beatrice had spent months arranging the perfect stage to finalize my destruction. She had gathered my mother, my sister, and her lawyers in one room, expecting me to walk in as a terrified, defenseless victim. She wanted an audience. She wanted a spectacle. "Thank you for the warning, Jamal," I said, my voice steady, devoid of any panic. "I appreciate you telling me this. You understand what I'm saying, right? You cannot go near that estate." He reiterated, his concern genuine. "I understand perfectly," I replied, staring at the handwritten proof of my father's suffering. I ended the call, lowering the phone from my ear. I did not move. I stood in front of the auditor's matrix I had built on the wall of my spare room. Beatrice had orchestrated a flawless trap, confident that her wealth and her status made her untouchable. She believed she controlled the narrative because she controlled the family. But she did not know I had the calendar. She did not know I had uncovered the White Rose Foundation. She did not know she had just invited a forensic auditor to the scene of her own crime. "I am not going to hide," I whispered to the empty room, my eyes fixed on the red twine. "I am going to the dinner, and I am bringing the receipts. I needed my own movements completely untraceable. I had 48 hours until the Sunday dinner. 48 hours to transform a pocket-sized leather calendar into a weapon capable of dismantling a high-society fraud ring. I packed the calendar, my handwritten notes, and the forged check copies the detectives had inadvertently left behind into a nondescript black briefcase. I left my apartment, taking the service stairs to avoid the cameras in the main lobby, and drove straight to the financial district.
I was not going to a defense attorney. A defense attorney would advise me to stay quiet, to negotiate, to hide behind legal privilege, while Beatrice destroyed my life in the court of public opinion. I needed an attack dog. I needed a forensic accountant. I walked into a mid-tier accounting firm on LaSalle Street, bypassing the receptionist entirely. I marched straight to a corner office at the end of the hall. The nameplate on the frosted glass door read, Marcus Vance, Senior Forensic Investigator. Marcus was a former colleague from my early days in compliance auditing. He was brilliant, ruthless with numbers, and harbored a deep-seated hatred for white-collar criminals who hid behind charitable tax exemptions. I pushed the door open without knocking. Marcus looked up from a stack of spreadsheets, his brow furrowed in annoyance until he recognized my face. "Claire," he said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. "I heard about the suspension. Word travels fast in the compliance network. What the hell happened? You are the last person I would expect to get caught skimming hospice funds." "I am not skimming anything, Marcus," I said, dropping my briefcase onto his desk with a heavy thud. "I am being framed, and I need your help to prove it." I unlatched the briefcase and pulled out the leather calendar. I set it carefully on his pristine desk blotter. I laid out the photocopies of the forged checks, the demand letter from Beatrice's attorneys, and my handwritten notes, mapping the withdrawal dates to the extortion threats. Marcus picked up the calendar, turning the worn leather over in his hands. He opened it, his eyes scanning the microscopic handwriting. The annoyance on his face vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused intensity of an investigator who had just found a smoking gun. "This is a ledger," he murmured, tracing the numbers with his pen. "Your father documented the extortion." "Yes," I replied, pulling up a chair and leaning forward. "But it is not just extortion. Look at the routing numbers on the forged checks Beatrice presented to Human Resources. She did not deposit the money into her personal accounts. She routed it through a commercial entity." I slid a printout of the Illinois Secretary of State Registry across the desk. The White Rose Foundation. Beatrice is the sole executive director. It is registered as a nonprofit dedicated to end-of-life care. Marcus grabbed the printout. His eyes darted between the routing numbers on the forged checks and the corporate tax identification number listed on the registry. He typed rapidly on his keyboard, accessing a proprietary financial database that cross-referenced tax-exempt organizational filings. The silence in the office stretched for 3 agonizing minutes. The only sound was the rapid clatter of his keystrokes and the soft hum of the central air conditioning. I watched his face. I watched the realization dawn on him, the slow widening of his eyes as the magnitude of the fraud crystallized on his monitors. "Claire," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, "this is not just a family dispute over an inheritance. This is a highly sophisticated money laundering operation." He spun his monitor around so I could see the screen. He had pulled the publicly available tax returns for the White Rose Foundation over the past 5 years. The numbers were staggering. "Look at these incoming donations," Marcus pointed at a column of figures. "They receive hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, all categorized as private anonymous gifts for palliative care assistance. But look at their operational expenditures." I leaned in my eyes, scanning the ledger. The foundation spent less than 5% of its incoming capital on actual charitable services. The remaining 95% was funneled into exorbitant administrative costs, consulting fees, and luxury event planning. "She is washing the money," I said, the cold truth settling heavily in my stomach. "She extorts vulnerable, dying people like my father. She forces them to sign over their assets, deposits the funds into her tax-exempt charity under the guise of medical donations, and then pays herself massive consulting fees out the back door. It is completely untraceable unless you have the original extortion ledger to prove the donations were coerced." "Exactly," Marcus confirmed, tapping the leather calendar. "Without this book, she is just a wealthy socialite running an inefficient charity. With this book, she is committing federal tax fraud, elder financial abuse, and felony money laundering. She is using the foundation as a personal slush fund, and she is framing you to cover the final $75,000 extraction." We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the sheer scale of Beatrice's criminality. My aunt was not just a manipulative bully. She was a predator who had built a financial empire on the suffering of dying men and women. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice steady, stripped of any residual fear. Marcus did not hesitate. "We go nuclear."
For the next 6 hours, Marcus and I worked methodically, dismantling Beatrice's financial fortress brick by brick. We digitized every page of my father's calendar, creating high-resolution encrypted scans of the handwritten extortion notes. We cross-referenced every single withdrawal date in the calendar with the corresponding deposit spikes in the White Rose Foundation's public tax records. The correlation was flawless. It was a perfect, damning paper trail. We compiled the digital evidence, the forged check copies, the extortion demand letter, the corporate registry data, and the mapped financial matrix into a single comprehensive dossier. It was a masterpiece of forensic auditing. It was a bulletproof indictment. Marcus transferred the encrypted file onto a secure thumb drive. I am sending this directly to a contact I have at the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. He set his fingers flying across the keyboard to draft a secure email. The local police might care about a $75,000 family embezzlement claim, but the IRS will absolutely tear her apart for 5 years of systemic tax fraud using a charitable exemption. He hit send. The progress bar zipped across the screen. The file vanished into the encrypted servers of the federal government. "It is done," Marcus said, leaning back and exhaling a long breath. By Monday morning, Beatrice Sterling is going to have federal agents seizing her assets and freezing her foundation accounts. She just does not know it yet. I picked up the original leather calendar, sliding it carefully back into my briefcase. "She thinks she has me cornered," I said quietly. "She thinks I'm going to walk into her dining room tomorrow night and sign a confession to save myself from jail." Marcus looked at me, a grim smile playing on his lips. "What are you going to do, Claire?" "I am going to attend a family dinner," I replied, snapping the briefcase shut. Sunday afternoon arrived with a biting, overcast chill that seemed entirely appropriate for an execution. I spent the morning preparing not as a guest, but as an operative walking into hostile territory. I chose my wardrobe with deliberate care. I did not want to look like the beaten, terrified victim Beatrice expected. I wanted to look like the compliance auditor who had just dismantled her life. I put on my sharpest black tailored suit. The cut was precise, severe, devoid of any softening elements. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe bun, ensuring there were no loose strands to betray any nervousness. I applied minimal makeup, just enough to present a cold, unreadable mask. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was unrecognizable from the exhausted daughter who had wept in the hospital corridor 8 months ago. This woman was armed, dangerous, and utterly detached from the emotional manipulation of her blood relatives. I picked up the black briefcase containing the original calendar and the printed dossier. I walked out of my apartment, leaving the eviction notice lying ignored on the floor. I drove to Beatrice's estate in the affluent northern suburbs. The drive took 45 minutes, giving me ample time to steady my breathing and lock my emotions into an impenetrable vault. I was not walking into a home. I was walking onto a battlefield. I turned onto the long, sweeping driveway that led to Beatrice's sprawling colonial mansion. The manicured lawns and towering oak trees reeked of old money and unearned privilege. The driveway was already packed with luxury vehicles. I recognized Olivia's sleek sport utility vehicle, parked near the front entrance, alongside the expensive sedans of various aunts, uncles, and cousins who had gathered to witness my public humiliation. I parked my modest sedan at the very end of the driveway, boxing in a Mercedes. I did not care. I stepped out of the car, the cold wind whipping at my coat. The massive front doors of the estate loomed ahead, framed by pristine white columns. I gripped the handle of my briefcase. My pulse was steady. My mind was clear. The trap was fully set. The federal authorities had the digital evidence. The local police were waiting on Beatrice's signal. The family was assembled inside, sharpening their knives, waiting for the disgraced daughter to crawl in and beg for mercy. I walked up the stone steps, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I did not ring the doorbell. I did not wait for permission to enter. I grasped the heavy brass handle, pushed the double doors open, and stepped into the lion's den. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the foyer. The sprawling mansion hummed with the low, sophisticated murmur of a high society gathering. The scent of roasted meats, expensive floral arrangements, and rich oaky red wine drifted through the air, creating a suffocating atmosphere of curated perfection. I bypassed the coat check entirely, keeping my black wool overcoat buttoned and my briefcase firmly in my right hand. I followed the sound of clinking crystal and polite laughter down the vaulted hallway, my heels striking the polished marble floor with a steady rhythmic cadence. I turned the corner and stepped into the formal dining room. The space was massive, dominated by a long mahogany table that could easily seat 20 guests. An antique Persian rug spanned the floor beneath it, muffling the sound of my approach. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the assembled crowd. There were at least a dozen people present: aunts, uncles, and older cousins, the upper echelon of the family hierarchy, all dressed in designer evening wear, sipping wine, and picking at elegant appetizers. It was a perfectly staged tableau of aristocratic mourning, a dinner ostensibly held to honor my late father, but entirely devoid of any genuine grief. My appearance at the archway shattered the performance instantly. The ambient chatter died an abrupt, unnatural death. One moment the room was filled with the sophisticated hum of conversation. The next, utter silence descended so profound that the crackle of the logs in the grand stone fireplace suddenly sounded like gunshots. 12 pairs of eyes snapped toward me, widening in shocked confusion and poorly concealed disdain. I scanned the room, cataloging the players in Beatrice's orchestrated theater. My mother Cynthia sat near the middle of the table. She wore a dark conservative dress, her hands clutching a wine glass. The moment she saw me, her face drained of color. She immediately averted her gaze, turning her head sharply toward the window, physically shrinking into her chair to avoid making eye contact with the daughter she had abandoned. Across from her sat my older sister Olivia. She looked impeccable, her hair styled perfectly, diamonds glittering at her throat. She did not look away. She crossed her arms over her chest, leaning back in her chair, and rolled her eyes with an exaggerated theatrical display of utter contempt. Standing near the fireplace, slightly removed from the main cluster of guests, was Jamal. He held a tumbler of bourbon, his posture rigid. He did not sneer or look away. He frowned, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a silent, urgent warning. He had told me not to come. He had warned me about the trap, and now I was walking straight into it. He shook his head slightly, a nearly imperceptible motion, advising me to turn around and run. I ignored the warning. I looked toward the head of the table. Beatrice Sterling sat in a high-backed, ornately carved chair that resembled a throne. She wore a tailored burgundy dress that exuded authority and wealth. A delicate gold chain rested against her collarbone. As I met her gaze, a slow, predatory smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a victor watching her vanquished opponent crawl back into the arena to surrender. "Well," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying easily across the cavernous room, shattering the tense silence. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence. The prodigal thief returns." A collective, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the guests. A few aunts exchanged scandalized glances. Uncle Richard, Beatrice's husband, cleared his throat loudly and took a deep sip of his scotch. I did not speak. I did not flinch. I continued walking slowly into the room, my posture straight, my expression an unreadable mask. "I must admit," Claire Beatrice continued, her tone dripping with saccharine condescension, "I am surprised you had the nerve to show your face here tonight. After the disgraceful stunt you pulled, draining your dying father's accounts to fund your pathetic little lifestyle, I assumed you would be hiding in a cheap motel somewhere, waiting for the police to kick down the door." I stopped a few feet from the table, my grip tightening slightly on the handle of my briefcase. I let her speak. I let her fill the room with her fabricated narrative. "But I suppose desperation breeds humility," Beatrice purred, leaning forward and resting her elbows on the polished mahogany. "You finally realized you have nowhere left to run. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your career is ruined. You are entirely out of options. You finally figured out how to crawl back and beg for mercy." Olivia let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed harshly against the crystal glasses. "Begging is too good for her, Aunt B," Olivia sneered, standing up from her chair to ensure she had the room's full attention. She dragged our father's name through the mud. She stole his dignity while he was taking his last breaths. She should be down on her knees. Olivia pointed a manicured finger directly at the Persian rug beneath my feet. "Get on your knees, Claire. Get down and apologize to this entire family for what you did. Apologize for being a disgusting, greedy parasite. Show some actual remorse for once in your miserable life before Aunt B calls the detectives and has you hauled away in cuffs." The cruelty of the demand hung heavy in the air. The sheer audacity of my sister, a woman who had barely visited the hospital, demanding I kneel and beg for forgiveness over a crime I did not commit, was suffocating. I saw my mother flinch at Olivia's harsh words, but Cynthia remained silent, taking another desperate sip of her wine, refusing to intervene. I looked at Olivia. I looked at Beatrice. I looked at the dozen relatives who were watching me with cold, judgmental eyes, waiting for me to break, waiting for the tears, the apologies, the desperate pleas for a second chance. I gave them nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I did not attempt to argue against the absurd accusations. Arguing would imply that their words held weight. It would imply that I was participating in their game. I walked calmly toward the far end of the long mahogany table. There was a single empty chair positioned opposite Beatrice, the seat reserved for the accused. I pulled the heavy chair out. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor, a jarring sound that made several guests wince. I sat down. I placed my black briefcase deliberately on the table in front of me. I folded my hands together, resting them quietly on the polished wood. I looked directly down the length of the table, meeting Beatrice's triumphant gaze with absolute chilling serenity. "I am not here to apologize, Beatrice." I said, my voice low, even and entirely devoid of emotion. The quietness of my tone forced everyone in the room to strain slightly to hear me drawing their undivided attention. "I am here to conclude our business." Beatrice's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The lack of fear in my demeanor unsettled her, but her arrogance quickly masked it. She let out a dismissive scoff, waving her hand elegantly in the air. "Conclude our business," she repeated, her tone mocking. "You are in no position to negotiate, Claire. You have absolutely nothing to bargain with. You are a cornered rat. The only business we have tonight is determining exactly how you are going to repay the money you stole, and whether I decide to let you rot in a federal prison." She turned her head slightly, gesturing toward the shadowy corner of the room near the entrance to the kitchen. "Mr. Sterling, please bring the document forward. Let us put an end to this unpleasantness." From the shadows, a man in a sharp gray suit stepped forward. He was not a relative. He was the family lawyer, the same attorney whose name was printed on the civil demand letter the detectives had tossed onto my kitchen counter. He walked briskly toward my end of the table, carrying a leather portfolio. The trap was springing shut. The intervention was a thinly veiled execution, a coordinated assault designed to force my signature through public humiliation and legal threats. I remained perfectly still, watching the lawyer approach, my hands folded, waiting for the final piece of Beatrice's extortion to land on the table. The lawyer, a man named Sterling, reached the end of the mahogany table. His face was a mask of practiced professional detachment. He did not look me in the eye. He simply opened his leather portfolio, extracted a thick, multi-page document secured with a heavy legal binder clip, and slid it smoothly across the polished wood. It came to rest directly in front of my folded hands. Beside the document, he placed a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I looked down at the paper. The title, printed in bold, uncompromising black ink, read, "Formal Admission of Guilt and Promissory Note." I did not need to read the fine print to know what it contained. It was a legally binding confession. It stated that I, Claire Bennett, took full and sole responsibility for the unauthorized withdrawal of $75,000 from the estate of Thomas Bennett. It further stipulated that I agreed to a repayment schedule totaling $150,000 to be paid directly to a trust managed by Beatrice Sterling to cover the principal, accrued interest, and punitive damages for emotional distress inflicted upon the family. It was a masterpiece of legal extortion. If I signed it, I would permanently validate Beatrice's lies. I would willingly hand her a civil judgment that would garnish my wages and destroy my credit for the rest of my life, all while providing her with a signed confession that would make any criminal defense impossible. Beatrice pushed her chair back and stood up. The movement commanded the attention of everyone in the dining room. She smoothed the front of her burgundy dress and began a slow, deliberate walk down the length of the table toward me. Her heels clicked softly on the Persian rug. "There it is," Claire Beatrice announced, her voice, honey-sweet, yet laced with an unmistakable lethal edge. "The solution to all your problems, a clean, quiet resolution." She stopped a few feet away, looking down at me with an expression of manufactured pity. I know you are terrified, Beatrice continued, adopting the tone of a benevolent savior offering salvation to a wretched sinner. The detectives made it very clear what you are facing. Felony embezzlement, grand larceny. You are looking at 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. You will lose your license, your career, and any chance of a normal life. You will be locked in a cell with absolute scum. She gestured elegantly toward the document on the table. But we are family, she said, placing a hand over her heart, a gesture so theatrical it made my stomach turn. Despite the horrific betrayal you committed against my brother, I do not want to see you destroyed. I am offering you a way out. Sign that paper, acknowledge your theft, and commit to repaying the estate. If you do that right now tonight, I will personally call the lead detective in the morning. I will withdraw the criminal complaint. The investigation stops. You walk out of here a free woman. Beatrice leaned in slightly, resting her manicured hands on the edge of the table. Her sweet tone vanished, replaced by a harsh, guttural whisper meant only for me. This is the last piece of grace this family will ever extend to you. Sign the damn paper, Claire, or I will let the state bury you. The silence in the room grew thicker, heavier, pressing against my eardrums. 12 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. They were watching a public execution, waiting for the blade to fall, waiting for the disgraced daughter to formally accept her ruin. From the middle of the table, a pathetic, muffled sob broke the silence. "Claire, please," my mother whimpered. Cynthia had finally turned to look at me, her face pale tears streaking her expensive makeup. "Just sign it. Please. Do not make this harder than it has to be. B is being so generous. Just sign the paper and apologize so we can put this nightmare behind us. Do not drag our family name through a criminal trial. Think of your father's memory." The utter spinelessness of her plea, the way she weaponized my father's memory to beg for my surrender, sent a spike of cold fury straight through my veins. She was willing to let me be branded a felon and indentured to her sister-in-law for decades, just to avoid the social embarrassment of a scandal. Olivia let out an exasperated sigh, crossing her arms tighter. "For God's sake, Claire, stop being so stubborn. You got caught. It is over. Take the deal before Aunt B changes her mind and lets the cops drag you out of here. You owe us this much." Jamal, still standing by the fireplace, did not speak. His jaw was clenched tight. He looked at the document, then looked at me, his eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. "Do not do it." I looked at the heavy gold pen resting on the table. The metallic surface caught the light from the chandeliers above. It looked heavy, imposing an instrument designed to sign away my freedom. I reached out slowly. My hand hovered over the wood. I picked up the fountain pen. A collective, silent exhale seemed to ripple through the room. The tension broke slightly. Beatrice's rigid posture relaxed just a fraction. A smug, victorious smile began to form on her lips. She had won. She had broken the rebellious niece. The money was secured, the paper trail was sanitized, and her power over the family remained absolute. Cynthia buried her face in her napkin, weeping with relief. Olivia smirked, already reaching for her wine glass to celebrate the victory. I held the gold pen between my fingers, feeling its cool weight. I looked down at the signature line on the promissory note. Then, deliberately moving with agonizing slowness, I gripped the cap of the pen. I twisted it. The soft, metallic scrape of the threads unspooling sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. I pulled the cap off. Beatrice stepped back slightly, crossing her arms, her triumphant smile now fully realized, waiting for the ink to hit the paper. Instead, I placed the cap gently on the table. I set the uncapped pen down right next to it, parallel to the confession document. The NIB pointed harmlessly toward the center of the table. I did not sign. The triumphant smile on Beatrice's face froze. The collective relief in the room instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp spike of confusion. Olivia lowered her wine glass, her brow furrowing. Cynthia stopped crying, peering over her napkin with wide, fearful eyes. "What are you doing?" Beatrice demanded, her voice losing its honeyed coating, dropping back into a harsh, commanding bark. "Pick up the pen, Claire." I did not look at her. I did not acknowledge the command. I kept my gaze fixed on the center of the table. I reached down beside my chair, slipping my hand into the open top of my black briefcase. The leather exterior felt cool and rigid. My fingers bypassed the thick stack of printed forensic audits, bypassing the photocopies of the forged checks, bypassing the corporate registry documents. My hand found the object I was looking for. It was small, worn, and heavy with the weight of unassailable truth. I closed my fingers around it and slowly pulled it from the briefcase. My hand emerged from the darkness of the briefcase. I did not hold a stack of printed defense arguments. I did not pull out a legal countersuit or a desperate letter pleading my innocence. I held something far more devastating. I brought my hand up to the level of the mahogany table. The room watched breathless as I set the object down onto the polished wood. It was an old pocket-sized desk calendar. The dark brown leather binding was scuffed at the corners, worn smooth from years of constant friction inside the breast pocket of a heavy winter coat. The embossed gold lettering on the cover, 2019 to 2023, caught the light of the chandeliers. It looked entirely out of place in this room of crystal and silver. It looked like a piece of garbage. To anyone else, it was just an outdated planner. But to the woman standing at the head of the table, it was a live grenade. I kept my hand flat against the leather cover. The silence in the dining room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum waiting to be broken. I looked up, locking my eyes directly onto Beatrice. Her smug, victorious expression had not yet faltered. She looked at the small book with utter incomprehension, her brow furrowing, slightly annoyed by the delay, but not yet understanding the threat. I pressed my index finger against the center of the calendar. With a single deliberate motion, I pushed it forward. The leather slid smoothly across the polished mahogany surface, gliding past the gold-plated fountain pen, past the heavy legal binder clip of the extortion contract. The sound of the sliding leather was a soft, dry whisper that seemed to echo off the vaulted ceiling. The calendar came to a stop exactly 3 inches from the edge of the table, directly in front of where Beatrice stood. "You are right, Aunt B," I said. My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was quiet, steady, and chilled to absolute zero. It cut through the heavy air of the dining room with the precision of a scalpel. "I am an auditor. I track the numbers. I hunt down the missing funds. I keep the books." I paused, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, letting the weight of my words settle over the table. But I was not the one writing them down. The one keeping the records was my father. Beatrice's eyes dropped from my face to the small leather book resting inches from her hand. I watched the exact moment the realization hit her. It did not happen slowly. It happened with the violent, catastrophic speed of a structural collapse. The confident, condescending smile that had been plastered across her face fractured and shattered. Her jaw dropped slightly. The blood drained from her cheeks so fast that her expensive, meticulously applied foundation suddenly looked like a mask painted onto a corpse. Her skin took on a sickening, ashen pallor that was entirely unhideable. She recognized the calendar. She knew exactly what it was, and more importantly, she knew exactly the kind of man her brother had been. Thomas Bennett never forgot a number. He never made a transaction without a receipt, and he documented every detail of his life in microscopic black ink. Beatrice's right hand, the hand loosely holding a long-stemmed crystal glass of red wine, began to tremble. It started as a subtle vibration barely noticeable, but quickly escalated into a violent, uncontrollable shake. The dark red liquid sloshed aggressively against the sides of the delicate glass, threatening to spill over the rim and stain the pristine Persian rug beneath her feet. She stared at the worn leather cover, paralyzed. She did not reach out to touch it. She looked at it as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the mahogany, ready to strike. What is that?" Olivia demanded from across the table, her voice breaking the heavy silence. Her arrogant sneer faltered, replaced by a sudden sharp edge of uncertainty. She looked from the calendar to Beatrice, sensing the abrupt shift in the atmosphere, recognizing the stark terror radiating from our aunt. "What are you trying to pull, Claire? What is that garbage?" I did not look at Olivia. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the woman standing at the head of the table, watching the terror consume her. "Open it, Bea," I said softly. My voice carried the unmistakable tone of an executioner offering a final request. "Open it and read the December entry to the family. Read them exactly what he wrote about the $75,000. Beatrice did not move. Her breathing grew rapid, shallow. The crystal glass in her hand clinked sharply against her wedding ring as the tremors worsened. The sophisticated, untouchable matriarch of the Sterling family was disintegrating right in front of her curated audience. Sterling, the family lawyer, took a step forward from the shadows, sensing the collapse of his client. He reached his hand out toward the calendar, intending to intercept the evidence to shield Beatrice from whatever damage lay within those yellowed pages. "Do not touch that book," Jamal's voice boomed across the room. The sudden authoritative shout startled everyone. Jamal pushed himself off the stone fireplace, closing the distance to the table in 3 long strides. The compliant, silent observer was gone. He positioned himself between the lawyer and the table, using his broad frame to block Sterling's advance. Jamal looked down at the calendar, then looked at Beatrice's trembling, ashen face. His sharp, analytical mind instantly calculated the gravity of the situation. He did not know what was written inside that book, but he recognized the undeniable look of a cornered criminal. "Let her open it," Jamal commanded, his eyes fixed on Beatrice. "If she has nothing to hide, she can open the book and prove it." Beatrice swallowed hard, a visible, painful gulp. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting from Jamal's stern face to Olivia's confusion, to Cynthia's rising panic, and finally back to me. The walls of her elaborate, carefully constructed lie were caving in, and she had absolutely nowhere to run. Beatrice's mouth opened, forming a silent, desperate shape, but her throat was paralyzed. She could not force a single word of defense past her lips. The silence in the dining room was dense thick with the electric anticipation of impending ruin. I did not give her the chance to recover. I did not wait for her to find an excuse or a lie to shield herself. I reached back into my black briefcase. I pulled out a thick stack of printed high-resolution color scans. They were exact magnified replicas of the calendar pages. I set the stack on the table, picked up the top sheet, and held it up so the stark black ink of my father's handwriting was clearly visible under the chandelier light. "I will read it for you," I announced, my voice carrying the steady, resonant authority of a judge delivering a verdict. I looked down at the first scan. May 12th, I read, pacing the words to ensure every syllable landed with maximum impact. $25,000, liquidated long-term savings. I paused, letting the amount echo in the quiet room. I looked up, meeting Cynthia's terrified gaze. Transferred to the White Rose Foundation, I continued reading the bracketed text beneath the amount. Bea demanded the withdrawal. She threatened to freeze the primary medical accounts and block all payments to the hospice care nurses if I refused. She said she would leave me to suffocate in this bed. Cynthia gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. The sound was sharp, a genuine intake of horror. Several aunts murmured in disbelief. The brutal, callous nature of the threat recorded in the dying man's own hand shattered the illusion of the benevolent sister instantly. I did not stop. I placed the first page face down on the table and picked up the next. I was striking blows, and I intended to finish the job. August 14th. I read loudly. $15,000 cash, withdrawn from the joint checking account. I looked directly at my mother again. Her eyes were wide, brimming with tears of sudden, devastating realization. Given directly to Bea, I read, my voice devoid of pity. She threatened to cancel Cynthia's supplemental health insurance premium if I did not hand over the cash. She knew Cynthia's heart condition would bankrupt the estate without that coverage. She used my wife's life as leverage. "Mom, no." Cynthia whimpered, her voice cracking. She looked at Beatrice, her expression morphing from confusion to sheer, unadulterated horror. "Bea, you told me the insurance company raised the rates. You told me you paid the difference out of your own pocket to save me." Beatrice flinched, stepping backward, nearly knocking over her chair. She shook her head frantically, but no words came out. The wine in her glass spilled over the rim, dripping red drops onto the pristine rug. I picked up the third page. November 2nd, I continued, my voice cutting through Cynthia's sobbing. $30,000. Liquidated the emergency bonds. I turned my gaze toward Olivia. My older sister was standing now, her face flushed with anger, gripping the back of her chair. She was preparing to scream, preparing to launch into a tirade to defend the aunt who funded her lifestyle. Bea demanded the bonds, I read, raising my voice slightly to ensure Olivia heard every word. Threatened to legally challenge the family trust and erase Olivia's name from the inheritance list if I did not sign the transfer. She said she would tie the money up in probate court for a decade and leave Olivia with nothing. Olivia froze. Her mouth hung open. The angry retort died in her throat. She stared at the paper in my hand, then slowly turned her head to look at Beatrice. The realization that she had been used as a bargaining chip, that her future had been held hostage by the woman she was currently defending, hit her with visible force. You threatened my trust fund." Olivia stammered, her voice shaking, the arrogance completely stripped away. "That is a lie," Beatrice finally shrieked. Her voice was shrill, desperate, raw with panic. She slammed her hand against the table, the wine glass shattering, sending shards of crystal flying across the wood. "That is a fabricated document." She forged his handwriting. "It is a desperate, pathetic lie to cover her own embezzlement." Olivia seemed to grasp at this lifeline. "Yes," Olivia shouted, stepping forward, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You forged that calendar, Claire. Dad never wrote those things. You are just trying to drag Aunt B down with you because you got caught stealing the $75,000. I set the page down. I did not need to defend the authenticity of the calendar. I had brought someone who dealt exclusively in verifiable facts. "Wait!" The single word boomed across the dining room. It was not my voice. It was Jamal. Jamal stepped forward, moving away from the fireplace and stepping directly into the light of the chandelier. I was not looking at the calendar. He was looking at the printed scans scattered on the table. His brow was deeply furrowed, his eyes scanning the data with the rapid, calculating intensity of a commercial real estate director who spent his life analyzing ledgers and tax filings. His voice, a deep, resonant baritone, commanded the room, completely crushing Olivia's hysterical outburst. "What did you just say?" Claire Jamal asked, his gaze fixed on the first document I had read. "The destination of the funds. Read that name again." I looked at him, recognizing the sharp clarity in his eyes. He had caught the thread. He was pulling the entire tapestry apart. "The White Rose Foundation," I replied clearly. Jamal's face darkened. He turned his head slowly, locking his eyes onto Beatrice. The expression on his face was not anger. It was absolute clinical disgust. "The White Rose Foundation," Jamal repeated the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. "That is a registered non-profit entity. Olivia, shut your mouth and listen to me." Olivia opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer authority in her husband's voice silenced her instantly. She stepped back, terrified by the sudden shift in his demeanor. Aunt B. Jamal said, taking a slow step toward the head of the table. "You used the White Rose Foundation to file for a massive property tax exemption on this estate just last month. You claimed it was a charitable operational headquarters to avoid paying the county assessments. I reviewed the filing documents for you. I ran the comparables." Jamal reached out and picked up one of the high-resolution scans from the table. He stared at the numbers written in my father's hand. "I remember the financial disclosures you provided for that exemption." Jamal continued, his voice dropping into a harsh, undeniable cadence. "You showed a sudden, massive influx of anonymous private donations, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing into the foundation accounts over the past 4 years. The deposit dates on your tax filings." Jamal looked up from the paper, his eyes boring into Beatrice's terrified face. "They matched these withdrawal dates perfectly." The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was structural. It was the sound of an entire criminal enterprise being exposed under the harsh light of professional verification. Jamal tossed the scan back onto the table. His disgust was palpable. "She did not forge this calendar," Olivia, Jamal said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Those numbers are real. The money flow matches the tax records precisely. Your aunt is not a victim. She is running a money laundering operation, and she used your dying father to fund it." Jamal's confirmation slammed into the room with the force of a physical blow. He was not a disgruntled relative. He was not a suspect fighting for survival. He was an objective, highly successful financial director, validating the evidence in real time. His assessment carried a weight that shattered Beatrice's carefully constructed narrative beyond any hope of repair. The collective gaze of the dozen relatives shifted in unison. The eyes that had burned with judgment and contempt toward me mere minutes ago now turned toward the head of the table. They locked onto Beatrice, their expressions morphing rapidly from confusion to suspicion and finally to undeniable revulsion. The matriarch of the Sterling family was exposed. The illusion of the benevolent, grieving sister had evaporated, leaving behind the stark, terrifying reality of a predator. Beatrice's reaction was instantaneous and entirely unhinged. The sophisticated veneer she had maintained for decades dissolved completely. She did not attempt to formulate a legal defense or offer a plausible explanation for the matching tax records. She reverted to the primal, desperate instincts of a cornered animal. "This is a conspiracy!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice shattering into a hysterical, grating pitch. Her hands flew into the air, gesturing wildly toward Jamal and me. "You are all colluding against me. Jamal, how dare you? After everything I have done for your career, you stand in my dining room and accuse me of fraud. You are backing a thief." Jamal did not flinch. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture radiating absolute contempt. "I am backing the math, Beatrice. The numbers do not lie. You do." Beatrice let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She lunged forward, her hands slamming onto the polished mahogany table with brutal force. Her eyes, wide and frantic, locked on to the small brown leather calendar resting near my briefcase. She recognized it as the source of her destruction, the physical embodiment of the evidence that was currently dismantling her life. "It is a forgery," she screamed, her voice cracking as she reached across the table, her manicured fingers clawing desperately at the polished wood. She fabricated the whole thing to save herself. "I will not let this piece of garbage destroy my family." Her hand clamped down on the leather cover. She snatched the calendar from the table, gripping it with a white-knuckled intensity. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths as she held the small book aloft, preparing to rip the pages from their binding, preparing to physically destroy the evidence in front of the entire assembly. She expected me to react. She expected me to lunge across the table to fight her for the book, to panic, as the proof of my innocence was threatened with destruction. I did not move. I remained seated in my chair, my hands resting quietly on the table. I looked up at her, watching the frantic, terrified energy radiating from her shaking frame. I allowed a slow, cold smile to touch the corners of my mouth. "Tear it, Aunt B," I said quietly. The softness of my voice contrasted sharply with her hysterical screaming, drawing the attention of everyone in the room back to me. Beatrice froze her hands, gripping the calendar tightly poised to rip the spine apart. She stared at me, her eyes wide with paranoid confusion. "Go ahead," I encouraged, gesturing slightly toward the book in her hands. "Rip it to pieces. Throw it in the fireplace. Do whatever makes you feel better." I leaned back in my chair, uncrossing my legs and resting my hands on the armrests, completely relaxed. "It is just a high-resolution color photocopy." I stated, my tone conversational, almost bored. "The leather binding is real. I bought it at a vintage shop yesterday to wrap the replica pages. I knew you would try to destroy it the moment you realized what it contained. I wanted to see you panic." Beatrice stopped breathing. Her hands, still gripping the replica calendar, began to shake violently again. She stared down at the object in her grasp, her mind struggling to process the deception. She had fallen into the trap flawlessly, her desperate attempt to destroy the evidence serving only to further cement her guilt in front of a dozen witnesses. Her grip loosened. The replica calendar slipped from her fingers, tumbling onto the table with a dull thud, landing amidst the scattered color scans and the broken shards of her wine glass. She staggered backward, bumping into her high-backed chair. She looked like a woman who had just realized she had stepped off a cliff and was currently in free fall, waiting for the inevitable impact. Cynthia, who had been watching the exchange in horrified silence, finally found her voice. She stepped away from the table, clutching her purse to her chest as if it were a shield. Claire Cynthia stammered, her voice thin and trembling, completely stripped of the righteous anger she had wielded against me on the phone. "If that is a copy, where is the original? Where is your father's actual calendar?" The question hung in the air, thick with dread. The entire room waited for the answer, realizing that the location of the original document would determine the ultimate fallout of this confrontation. I stood up slowly, deliberately. The wooden legs of my chair scraped softly against the Persian rug. I reached down and picked up my black briefcase, snapping the heavy metal latches shut. The sharp clicks echoed like final judgments in the quiet room. I smoothed the front of my black tailored blazer, buttoning the single center button with precise, unhurried movements. I was no longer the accused daughter sitting at the end of the table. I was the compliance auditor, and the audit was complete. I looked at my mother, then shifted my gaze to lock onto Beatrice's terrified, pale face. I did not raise my voice. I delivered the final blow with absolute surgical precision. The original ledger I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the farthest corners of the dining room, was securely sealed inside the evidence vault of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division in Washington, D.C. at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing the air out of the room. The mention of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division changed the atmosphere entirely. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a hospice fund. This was the invocation of the federal government, an entity that did not negotiate, did not care about social standing, and pursued financial crimes with relentless mechanized efficiency. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. I slowly withdrew a single sheet of stiff white paper. I held it up. The stark red seal of the federal government was stamped prominently in the upper right corner, an undeniable marker of official receipt. "This is the intake confirmation," I stated, my eyes locked on Beatrice. I did not just send them the calendar Aunt B. I sent them the full forensic matrix. My colleague and I mapped every single withdrawal from my father's accounts directly to the corresponding deposit spikes in the public tax filings of the White Rose Foundation. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed. She looked like she was suffocating. The reality of the federal involvement was dismantling her cognitive functions. "You did not just extort a dying man," I continued, my voice sharp and unyielding, slicing through her panic. "You utilized those $75,000, along with hundreds of thousands more over the past 5 years, to wash illicit funds through a fabricated charity. You claimed tax exemptions on extorted money to finance your country club memberships and your designer wardrobe." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance slightly, ensuring she felt the full impact of her impending ruin. "In this country, Beatrice, you can manipulate the local police. You can use your donor status to pressure human resources directors. You can spin a narrative to convince a grieving family that I am a thief. But you cannot defraud the federal government. The IRS does not care about your charity galas. They only care about the paper trail, and I handed them a flawless, unalterable map of your entire money laundering operation." Olivia, who had remained frozen since Jamal's intervention, finally grasped the catastrophic scope of the situation. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. The realization that her affluent lifestyle, her social standing, and her family's reputation were irrevocably tied to a federal tax fraud syndicate hit her with crushing force. "Aunt B." Olivia gasped, her voice trembling violently. "Is this true? Tell me this is not true. Tell me the feds are not investigating you." Beatrice could not answer. Her gaze was fixed on the red seal of the receipt in my hand. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her chest heaving visibly beneath her burgundy dress. She took a clumsy, uncoordinated step backward, seeking distance from the evidence, seeking an escape that no longer existed. Her heel caught the edge of the heavy carved dining chair. She lost her balance. She pitched backward, her arms flailing wildly as she sought a handhold. Her hand struck the edge of the mahogany table, sweeping across a massive tiered crystal serving tray laden with expensive appetizers. The heavy crystal crashed to the floor. The sound of shattering glass exploded through the dining room, sharp and violent, perfectly mirroring the destruction of Beatrice Sterling's empire. Shards of crystal and scattered food sprayed across the priceless Persian rug. Beatrice collapsed onto the floor amidst the wreckage, her designer dress tangling around her legs. She did not attempt to stand. She remained on the floor, her hands gripping the edges of the shattered tray, staring blankly at the ruined carpet. The untouchable matriarch had fallen reduced to a trembling, broken figure, surrounded by the literal and figurative debris of her own arrogance. The relatives who had gathered to witness my execution now stared at Beatrice in horrified fascination. They were backing away instinctively, creating physical distance between themselves and the epicenter of a federal crime. The extravagant dinner party had officially transformed into a crime scene, and no one wanted to be caught in the blast radius. The collapse of Beatrice Sterling was not just a singular event. It was a catalyst that triggered a chain reaction of panic throughout the dining room. The guests who had eagerly gathered to watch my public humiliation were now scrambling to distance themselves from the wreckage. Olivia was the first to break the stunned silence. The arrogant sneer she had worn all evening vanished, replaced by a raw, unvarnished terror.
Her manicured hands flew to her face, her fingers digging into her carefully styled hair. She realized the implications of a federal tax investigation. The Internal Revenue Service did not just stop at the primary suspect. They audited the associates. They examined the family members. They traced every single dollar that had flowed out of the White Rose Foundation. Olivia had spent the last 5 years accepting generous gifts from our aunt. Luxury vacations, down payments on vehicles, expensive designer wardrobes. She had funded her superficial lifestyle with the very money Beatrice had extorted from our dying father. "No," Olivia shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical register. "No, this cannot be happening. Aunt B, tell them you did not give me any of that money. Tell them I did not know. I did not sign anything. You cannot drag me into this." She backed away from the head of the table, treating Beatrice like a contagious disease. Olivia was unraveling her pristine socialite facade, melting away to reveal the terrified, selfish core underneath. She looked wildly around the room, seeking someone to validate her innocence, seeking anyone who could promise her that her gated community and her country club memberships were safe. Her eyes found her husband. Jamal stood a few feet away, watching his wife's hysterical display with cold, clinical detachment. He did not step forward to comfort her. He did not offer a reassuring embrace. As a director of commercial real estate appraisal, Jamal understood the mechanics of federal asset forfeiture better than anyone in the room. He knew that the sprawling mansion we were standing in, the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway, and the offshore accounts Beatrice likely maintained were already marked for seizure. He knew that any financial ties to the Sterling family were now a toxic liability. Jamal looked at Olivia. He looked at the shattered crystal on the Persian rug. Then, moving with deliberate, unhurried precision, he took one step backward, then another. He was physically severing himself from the blast radius. Olivia reached a hand out toward him, her chest heaving with frantic sobs. "Jamal, do something. Call someone. Tell them we had nothing to do with her charity." Jamal did not answer her. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew his cell phone. He did not dial a crisis management firm. He did not call a criminal defense attorney to help his wife's family. He unlocked the screen, his thumb navigating swiftly through his contacts. He found the number for the senior partner at the family law firm he kept on retainer. He raised the phone to his ear, turning his back on Olivia and the rest of the ruined dining room. He was initiating his own exit strategy, cutting his losses, before the federal indictments could drag his own career into the mud. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and he had no intention of going down with the Sterling family. Before Jamal could even speak a word into his phone, a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the mansion. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, barely audible over Olivia's sobbing. But it grew rapidly, multiplying and amplifying as it tore through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. It was a chorus of sirens, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the cold winter night with terrifying speed. The relatives in the dining room froze their heads, turning in unison toward the grand floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the front wall of the estate. The sirens grew deafening, echoing off the stone facade of the mansion. The crunch of heavy tires tearing across the pristine gravel of the long driveway signaled their arrival. It was not a single local police cruiser responding to a domestic disturbance. It was a coordinated multi-agency convoy. A barrage of flashing red and blue strobe lights erupted outside. The intense rhythmic beams pierced through the sheer curtains, casting frantic dancing shadows across the mahogany table, the crystal chandeliers, and the pale, terrified faces of my family. The strobe lights reflected off the spilled wine and the shattered glass on the floor, turning the opulent dining room into a chaotic, surreal nightmare. The heavy thud of car doors slamming shut echoed from the front courtyard. The authoritative bark of commands cut through the wailing sirens. The federal agents had arrived, and they were securing the perimeter. Beatrice remained on the floor. Her legs were tangled in the expensive fabric of her burgundy silk dress, the hem now soaked in the dark red wine she had spilled. The untouchable matriarch, the woman who had orchestrated my father's suffering and attempted to orchestrate my imprisonment, was reduced to a groveling, pathetic figure amidst the ruins of her own appetizer tray. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated her face in harsh, unforgiving flashes. The heavy makeup could not hide the sheer, paralyzing terror etched into her features. She looked up from the stained carpet, her eyes finding mine.
All of her arrogance, all of her condescension, all of her venom had been stripped away. In its place was a desperate, silent plea. Her eyes begged for a mercy she had never extended to anyone else. She was looking at the niece she had discarded, silently pleading for me to stop the unstoppable force I had just unleashed upon her home. I looked down at her, my face an unreadable mask. I offered her nothing. No pity, no anger, no gloating. Her destruction was the natural, inevitable consequence of her own greed, and I was merely the auditor who had delivered the final report. Suddenly, a frantic blur of motion rushed into my peripheral vision. My mother, Cynthia, broke away from the cluster of paralyzed relatives. She scrambled across the dining room, her heels slipping on the polished wood floor. She lunged toward me, reaching out with trembling, clammy hands to grab my wrists. Her grip was painfully tight, her fingernails digging into the sleeves of my black blazer. Her face was contorted in a mask of sheer delusion and desperation. The smell of her expensive floral perfume mixed with the sour scent of nervous sweat. Claire Cynthia pleaded, her voice a rapid, breathless whisper. "Claire, you have to stop this. You have to go out there right now." She yanked on my arms, trying to physically turn me toward the front foyer, toward the heavy oak doors where the federal agents were currently gathering. "Tell them it is a mistake," Cynthia begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. "Tell the police you misunderstood the calendar. Tell them B was just helping your father. You can fix this, Claire. Just go out there and tell them you made it all up." The sheer audacity of her request sent a shockwave of cold clarity through my system. Even now, with the sirens wailing outside, with the flashing lights illuminating the room, with the undeniable proof of Beatrice's extortion and money laundering laid bare on the table, my mother was still trying to protect the predator. She was still demanding that I sacrifice myself to maintain the fragile, toxic illusion of our family's prestige. She wanted me to walk out to a team of federal investigators, retract my evidence, and likely face charges for filing a false report, all to save the sister-in-law who had tortured her dying husband. Cynthia could not accept the truth, because accepting the truth meant admitting her own complicity. It meant acknowledging that she had stood by and watched her husband be blackmailed. It meant admitting that she had allowed her daughter to be framed and evicted. She preferred the lie, and she was begging me to resurrect it. "Please, Claire." Cynthia sobbed, shaking my arms, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "We are a family. You cannot let them take her away. It will ruin our name. Just tell them it is a misunderstanding. I will do anything. I will pay you the $75,000 myself. Just make them go away." I looked at the woman clutching my wrists, the woman who had hung up the phone on me when I begged for help, the woman who had authorized the sale of my father's tools and memories, the woman who had demanded I sign a false confession to save her own social standing. The flashing red and blue lights painted her desperate face in alternating colors. The heavy, rhythmic pounding of fists began to echo against the massive front doors of the mansion. The authorities were not waiting for an invitation. They were coming in. I looked down at the trembling hands digging into the sleeves of my tailored blazer. Cynthia was weeping, her makeup running in dark, ruined rivers down her pale cheeks. She was begging me to rewind time to erase the consequences she had brought upon herself by aligning with a predator. The scent of her expensive floral perfume mixed with the sour, unmistakable odor of sheer panic. I did not shout. I did not pull away with a sudden, erratic jerk. I reached up and grasped her wrists. My grip was firm, clinical, and devoid of any familial warmth. I peeled her fingers off my jacket one by one, untangling myself from her desperate, suffocating grasp. "You chose to believe the woman who extorted your dying husband," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "You chose to protect her fabricated narrative over your own daughter. You authorized the auction of his memory and his tools just to save your fragile social standing." Cynthia shook her head, letting out a wretched, hollow sob. She tried to reach for me again, but I took a deliberate step backward, establishing a cold, physical boundary between us. Every person in this room made a choice. I continued my gaze, sweeping over my mother, then moving to Olivia, who was slumped against the wall in a state of catatonic shock. "Now the invoice is due, and everyone gets to pay." Before Cynthia could formulate another excuse, a deafening crash echoed from the front of the house. The heavy oak double doors were breached, striking the interior walls with a sound like thunder. A rush of freezing winter wind swept down the vaulted hallway, carrying with it the sharp, authoritative commands of federal law enforcement. A dozen agents streamed into the mansion. They moved with a mechanized, terrifying efficiency. Their dark tactical jackets bore the bold, unmistakable letters of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Heavy boots trampled over the pristine marble foyer, ignoring the priceless art and the curated elegance of the estate. Two agents entered the dining room. Their eyes scanned the paralyzed crowd before locking onto the woman, sitting amidst the shattered crystal and spilled wine on the floor. Beatrice Sterling, the lead agent, announced, his voice projecting a sterile, uncompromising authority that brooked no argument. "You are under arrest for federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." He read her the Miranda rights in a flat, practiced monotone. The words echoed off the high ceilings, sealing her fate. Beatrice did not fight. She did not scream. The reality of the federal badges stripped her of whatever remaining defiance she possessed. She held her wrists out her hands, shaking uncontrollably, and allowed the cold steel cuffs to be clamped over her skin. I did not stay to watch them lift her off the floor. The audit was over. The books were closed. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I moved past the terrified relatives, past my sister, and walked straight down the hallway. I bypassed the federal agents securing the perimeter. One of the lead investigators, a man holding a secure tablet, caught my eye and gave a single brief nod. It was the silent acknowledgement of a job executed flawlessly. I stepped through the shattered front entrance and out into the freezing Chicago night. The air was biting crisp and immaculate. I drew a deep breath, filling my lungs with the freezing wind. For the first time in 8 months, the crushing weight of false accusations and familial betrayal vanished. My chest felt light. I walked down the long, illuminated driveway toward my modest sedan. The flashing red and blue strobe lights cast long, erratic shadows across the manicured lawns, painting the wealthy estate in the colors of a crime scene. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The heater hummed to life, wrapping me in a quiet, isolated warmth. I shifted the car into drive and steered down the paved road, pulling away from the chaos. I merged onto the main thoroughfare leading back to the city. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the road ahead. I did not glance at the rearview mirror. There was nothing left behind me worth looking at. The justice system operates on a timeline of undeniable facts, and federal prosecutors do not offer lenient plea deals to individuals who launder money through fake medical charities. The fallout over the next several months dismantled the Sterling family with surgical precision. Beatrice was denied bail, deemed a flight risk due to her extensive offshore accounts. Facing a mountain of unassailable forensic evidence derived from my father's calendar and the corresponding tax records, her expensive legal team crumbled. She pleaded guilty to avoid a drawn-out public trial that would have exposed even more of her illicit network. The judge handed down a severe sentence in federal prison, stripping her of the lavish lifestyle she valued above human decency. The Internal Revenue Service proved to be a meticulous creditor. They pursued the unpaid taxes and the fraudulent charitable exemptions with relentless aggression. The sprawling suburban mansion was seized and auctioned off to cover the restitution. The luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, and the offshore investment portfolios were all liquidated to satisfy the federal government. Olivia and Cynthia did not escape the blast radius. Because they had accepted years of untaxed illicit gifts from Beatrice, their personal finances were subjected to brutal microscopic audits. The resulting tax penalties and legal fees bankrupted them. Olivia was forced to sell her home in the gated community. Jamal, true to his calculated nature, finalized his divorce proceedings before the ink on Beatrice's indictment was even dry. He vanished from their lives, leaving Olivia to navigate her financial ruin alone. Cynthia attempted to call me several times during the audits. She received an automated message stating the number had been disconnected. As for the hospital network, the revelation that a prominent board member was running a federal money laundering scheme sent shockwaves through the corporate hierarchy. The Human Resources Director, Mr. Davis, was forced into early retirement for his gross mishandling of my suspension and his failure to conduct a proper internal review before acting on Beatrice's unverified claims. The hospital's executive board issued a formal written apology to me. But an apology is merely a sentiment. I required structure. I negotiated my return on my own terms. I did not just resume my previous duties. Armed with the leverage of having exposed a major liability and saving the network from further federal scrutiny, I demanded, and received a promotion to the head of internal audit. I secured a dedicated team, autonomous oversight, and a corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass walls that looked out over the Chicago skyline. It is a Tuesday morning, crisp and bright. I am sitting behind a sleek modern desk in my new office. The hum of the hospital network operates smoothly beneath me. I hold a ceramic mug of hot black coffee, savoring the bitter, robust flavor. I reach into my bag and pull out a small, simple wooden frame. Inside the frame is a photograph of my father, Thomas Bennett. He is standing in his garage wearing his oil-stained blue work shirt, smiling a genuine, unassuming smile. I place the frame carefully on the corner of my desk, right next to my pristine, leather-bound auditing ledger. People often speak of forgiveness as the ultimate tool for healing. They argue that letting go of anger is the only path to finding closure. The truth is far less poetic. Forgiveness is a concept frequently weaponized by the guilty to evade the consequences of their actions. It is a demand placed on victims to maintain a toxic equilibrium. I did not forgive the people who threw me out. I did not pardon the woman who extorted a dying man, nor the family members who cheered as my reputation was dragged through the mud. I did not heal by turning the other cheek. I found my peace by bringing the receipts. I found my equilibrium by balancing the ledger. I took the truth, sharpened it into a weapon, and systematically crushed the individuals who tried to destroy me. I take a slow sip of my coffee, looking out at the city stretching toward the horizon. The air in my office is quiet, secure, and entirely mine. The peace I feel right now is expensive. It cost me a family I never truly had, and it required a battle I never wanted to fight. But sitting here in the light of the morning sun, knowing that my father's final meticulous records served as the architect of my survival, I know the price was worth it. The books are balanced. The debt is paid. I run my thumb over the worn leather of my father's calendar. It sits permanently on my desk now, right beside his photograph. It serves as a daily reminder of what it takes to survive a system built to break you. People assume the hardest part of walking away from your bloodline is the loneliness. They are wrong. The hardest part is unlearning the lie that you owed them your silence in the first place. Looking back at the wreckage of Beatrice's empire and the scattered pieces of my former family, I carry 3 distinct truths with me. First, never underestimate the power of a quiet record. Predators thrive on chaos, manufactured emotion, and shifting narratives. They use volume and intimidation to make you doubt your own memory. You defeat them by stepping back and gathering the paperwork. Truth is not an argument you win by shouting across a dining room table. It is a ledger you present when the trap is fully set. The ink on a page will always outlast the breath of a lie. Second, shared DNA does not entitle anyone to your destruction. Society conditions us to absorb abuse simply because it comes packaged in the guise of familial duty. My mother and sister chose proximity to stolen wealth over fundamental decency, expecting me to be the sacrifice that kept their comfortable illusion intact. Cutting ties with them was not an act of vengeance. It was a structural necessity. You cannot reason with a toxic root. You can only sever it to save the rest of the tree. Third, you do not need to forgive the unforgivable to achieve peace. The world pushes a narrative that closure requires an embrace, a tearful apology, and a clean slate. I found my closure in a federal indictment and a disconnected phone line. Holding people accountable for their cruelty is the highest form of self-respect. You heal by ensuring the people who tried to bury you can never dig their way back into your life. Justice provides a far more stable foundation than a forced apology. I look out the glass walls of my office, watching the city move below. The storm they tried to drown me in only washed away the people I no longer needed to carry. I am Claire Bennett, and I balance the books. If you have ever had to build a fortress out of the stones your own family threw at you, I want to hear your experience. Drop a comment below and let me know how you established your boundaries and found your own justice. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge for more stories of surviving betrayal and taking back your power. Until next time, keep your walls high and always keep your receipts.